so excited about us adopting a baby, but we're a little confused about all the possibilities and challenges that go along with it. We're really hoping that you can help us make the right decision, Mark.
I guess I thought once we finally made the decision to adopt, it'd be a much easier process. The more research we've done, though, the more questions we have.
First, let's start with some background, folks. The adoption process and adoption laws have changed dramatically over the years. There are many more open adoptions. Adoption records are unsealed. Single people can adopt children. Gay people can adopt children. Children are adopted across racial lines. And unwed fathers have considerably more rights than they have had in the past. Now, as far as how you can adopt a child, basically you have two choices. You can either go through an agency or you can do a private adoption. A private adoption would involve finding someone to act as a go-between with the birth parents. Now, I can do that for you if you decide on that method.
A guy I work with adopted through a family attorney. The birth parents were teenagers and they gave their baby up, and their families contacted a family attorney to find a suitable home for the child. It was Jeff and Ann who knew this attorney that found the baby.
I've helped many couples with private adoptions, but whether the adoption is private or an agency adoption, it must first go through the courts. And here's how that works. Let's say a doctor who knows that I handle private adoptions notifies me that he has a patient who's pregnant and would like to give her child up for adoption. The first thing I would do is to contact the birth mother and the birth father, if he's around, and talk to them about what it actually means to consent to adoption. I have to make sure that the birth parents aren't under any duress from their parents, friends, or family members. If everything looks okay, then I put together the consent document and wait for the child to be born. To be valid, the consent cannot be obtained until 72 hours after the birth. This gives the birth mother time to really consider what she's doing. If she's still okay with this, then we turn the baby over to the adoptive parents, and the adoption process through the courts begins.
Well, I've heard horror stories about parents who change their minds at the last minute. How do we avoid that?
In our state, birth parents can revoke the consent right up to the time the court approves the adoption. But the court must approve the revocation, and in our state, it's pretty hard to revoke consent unless the birth parents can prove duress. That's why I try and make sure that everyone's clear right from the beginning what it means to consent.
You mentioned unwed fathers have rights too. What if the father's not there to give his consent?
There are several scenarios. If the birth father has not acknowledged paternity at the time of the birth and the birth mother knows who he is, then we must publish a notice in the paper notifying him that as the punitive father, he has a right to know about the adoption. If he doesn't respond, the adoption proceeds. If the father is around but hasn't shown any interest in the child, or if he hasn't been supportive either emotionally or financially of the birth mother, then he probably won't have much right to consent or object to the adoption. However, if he has been supportive, acknowledged paternity, and had an active role throughout the pregnancy, he does have some rights when it comes to consenting to adoption. Each situation is a little different.
You know, it might be easier if we went through an agency.
There are a lot of agencies that handle adoptions. Many times, an agency adoption results from the involuntary termination of parental rights. For instance, if a child has been abused or neglected, the state can terminate the parent's right and the child can be placed with an adoptive family. Often, these children are adopted by other family members. It is more difficult for a parent to revoke their consent when an agency is involved. Also, agencies can do a lot of counseling for birth parents to make sure that they know that adoption is what they want for their child. Agencies also require a home study. For instance, the State Child Protective Services won't place any child without a home study to evaluate the fitness of potential parents. I think that's a good idea. Too bad biological parents don't have to pass some type of evaluation before they have kids. Maybe then we wouldn't have so many abused children.
It's a really good point. Okay, so say everything goes as planned and the parents don't revoke their right to consent. What happens in the courts next?
We would go through the formalities of giving notice to anyone who has an interest in the child. Then, after the notice period is over, we set up a time for the judge to approve the adoption. Typically, because the parents have already agreed to terminate their rights, we can include that as part of the adoption hearing. The court then approves the adoption as being in the best interest of the child. Once that happens, the child is yours, and all of his or her ties to the birth parents are severed. The records of the adoption proceeding are then sealed, and a new birth certificate is issued naming you as the parents. Unless, of course, you consent to an open adoption. In that situation, you would agree to contact between the child and his or her birth parents. That's a consideration you're going to want to think over rather carefully.
You're right. Those are big considerations. I mean, do we want the birth parents to have contact with our child? And do we want our child to have access to his or her birth records? I think private adoption is the way to go. Although I'm glad we're going to talk to some counselors before we make a decision.
You definitely have some decisions to make. I hope that I've at least answered some of your questions. As Marcia said earlier, there are cases where things go horribly wrong and the courts end up trying to entangle extremely complicated situations. But most of the time, adoptions go smoothly, whether they're private adoptions or agency adoptions.
Okay, well, we have so much work ahead of us, Mike, but think about it. This time next year, we could have our first child. It'll be like a dream come true.